My name is Carlo and I'm the Communications Coordinator of the World Economic Summit 2018.
Hi, my name is Giovanni and I'm a member of the Talks team.
We are honored to be joined by Professor Mario Monti, President of Bocconi University, lifetime Senator of the Italian Senate and former Prime Minister of Italy. Good morning, Professor Monti, and thank you so much for attending the World Economic Summit.
Thank you for your invitation. I'm really delighted to be here.
Thank you. In a recent article published on the Corriere della Sera, you criticized the current electoral campaign in Italy for the abundance of unrealistic policy proposals. Do you think that Italian politics has fallen into the trap of populism?
The abundance of electoral promises is not a new phenomenon, is not an exclusive phenomenon to Italy, of course, but one does notice this time round a particularly high degree of obviously unrealistic promises. I think this may well have to do with the fairly high degree of populism which permeates virtually all parties. We have revived ancient populists around. We have recent parties which have excelled in a form of bottom-up populism. We have leaders of some traditionally non-populist parties who nevertheless, when exercising the function of Prime Minister, did practice some top-down populism, and so on. Maybe it's also partly due to the monetary abundance that we have such an abundance of promises, because the QE policy by the ECB, which has had a number of astonishingly positive results, nevertheless has created an environment in which maybe the seriousness of some problems is not 100% perceived. Interestingly, however, to conclude on this question, for the first time I see in the Italian media, in the commentators, a clear backlash of rationalism, of fact-checking, of rebutting this way of considering the elector as completely delinked from the realities.
Yes, so we've noticed a sense of awareness on behalf
Yes.
of the media. That's very interesting.
So, how do you believe the upcoming Italian elections will shape the future of the European Union in terms of politics and economics?
Indeed, the Italian elections will be important, and they obviously come after the French elections of almost 1 year ago, and the lengthy process of Germany giving itself a government after the September elections. I would say that the effect, particularly of the French elections on the Italian electorate, will be rather strong. In particular, if the Italian elections, which will be held on March the 4th, would have been held 1 year earlier, as many advocated after the result of the referendum, then I believe the anti-EU positions would have been stronger. But after the Le Pen defeat and the Macron success in France, also in Italy and in Europe as a whole, the mood has a bit changed. And so I think that the degree of Euroscepticism has been moderated. There are no longer parties which explicitly seek to have a referendum to take Italy out of the euro, and so on. So I think the overall outcome will not be seen, at any rate, whoever wins, as an attack on the EU, number one. So there has been this de facto convergence of the parties on acceptance of the EU and the Eurozone. On the other hand, there has been a de facto convergence of all the parties in admitting those unrealistic promises, which, if ever followed up, would make life within the euro quite problematic for Italy. So what will happen, I believe, is that in the secret of their heart, all the party leaders are confident that whatever they may promise now, those of them who will be in government will be able to place much of the blame for being unable to deliver the promises on Brussels as usual. But apart from these political and psychological aspects, what I would expect is that Italy will need to quickly carve out a position of its own in the ongoing Franco-German debate. And there is indeed the need, if we want a balanced Eurozone and a balanced EU, for an active standing of Italy.
One of the key issues at the center of the debate around the European Union as an institution is the way the budget of the European Union is financed. The independent high-level group on own resources of the European Union, which you chaired, recently published its report that includes a series of recommendations to reform the EU budget. And this is in light of many critiques on behalf of parties of some member states that claim that their countries contribute to the EU more than they benefit from the EU. What is, in your opinion, the pivotal element that must change in the structure of the EU budget?
The mindset and the way the budget is presented and explained to people and to member states. Because, and this is really at the center of the report that you mentioned, yes, we make specific proposals on possible new own resources, but first of all, and perhaps even more important, we discuss the criteria on which the budget for the next 5 or 7 years should be founded, and we criticize very strongly the notion of the net balance and the antagonizing of net contributors versus net beneficiaries in the EU. I remember when I was Prime Minister of Italy in 2013, when the current 7-year budget was finally agreed, which will end up in 2020, the only element on which each head of government would be judged in his or her own country would have been precisely the net balance. Is the Italian Prime Minister able to get a better or a worse outcome on that perspective than Germany, France, etc.? No discussion really on the content of EU policies. And so, if you think of it, the heads of governments themselves participated in an exercise which represents the EU to the citizens as if it were really a zero-sum game. Because in the concept of the net balance, you give X in terms of money to Brussels, you receive Y, but you don't put in the notion what you receive in kind, namely in having a space of economic and other freedoms in which to exercise. And the recent events concerning the UK, which have brought back to our minds the arrangement between Norway and the EU, teach us how valuable, including in monetary terms, the single market, for example, is. So the first thing is to try to overcome this apparently simple, but in reality profoundly distorted notion, and also in the selection of the activities into which the EU should be engaged. We stress very much in the report the notion of European public good, which should bring European value added, etc., etc. This will require really an intensive and radical negotiation. The Commission will put out its proposal in May, and when I go back with my memory to the conditions surrounding us in 2013, it's incredible. Only 5 years elapsed, but there was no Brexit, there was no Trump, there weren't mass migrations into Europe, no massive refugee flows, terrorism had not hit systematically Europe, and there were, yes, Mr. Putin and Mr. Erdogan, but they were quite different from today.
Do you think that the EU will succeed in changing the mindset of the citizens and changing its image?
A very difficult task, but strictly necessary. And for example, I was positively struck by the fact that the first version, at least, we will see then the final one of the possible coalition agreement in Germany, says that the EU budget will have to be reconsidered in a more positive light, that the countries are all net beneficiaries in substance, and that Germany, for one, will have to consider paying more into the budget.
So, speaking of budgets, tax evasion is a serious problem in Italy. What do you think Italy should do to fight the rampant tax evasion that's straining its public finances?
Well, first of all, tax evasion and tax elusion, which are very serious problems in Italy, are also very serious problems across the EU. And I applaud very much to the increasing efforts of the European Commission and of the Council to modify the way in which the overall tax system in Europe functions so as to make life more difficult for those who enjoy the single market, often multinational companies not based in the EU, but exploit the subtleties of the single market in order to pay very little taxes. Concerning Italy, I believe this should be the number one priority in any political program. True, since several years there has been progress in the amount of tax evasion caught, but according to all estimates, there are enormous amounts not yet taken into the net. The culture should change, the language of political leaders should change, because if one of them talks and others have followed of taxation as the state putting its hands in the pockets of Italians, this already denotes a profoundly inappropriate vision of the relationship between the citizen and the state. So this is one of the aspects of the need to change the mindset, without which any structural reform is more difficult to introduce, hard to explain, and very difficult once it is introduced to be actually implemented and implanted into everyday's economic life.
I'm conscious we're running out of time. Just one faster final question. If you had to choose one reform that Italy should implement to boost its economic growth, what would you recommend? The most important reform?
Yes. Well, it's in part a reform, in part a new habit, sets of habits. But I would stress very much the fight against tax evasion, because many other reforms have already more or less been put in place, but this one is fundamental.
Professor Monti, thank you so much for joining us at the Work Economics Summit. It has been an immense honor.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure for me. Thank you very much.